So welcome to this early career researcher event for philosophers of education, but I think it's also relevant for people outside of philosophy, or really the idea is to help support people that are not in sort of strictly speaking empirical fields, because as you probably had experience with in the past, those kinds of research projects, in my experience anyway, tend to get quite a lot of support in the university, or some support in the university. So my name is Alison Brady. I think I know all of you already. And we've got 4 excellent expert speakers today who are going to talk about their experiences with research grant applications, which is sort of the aim for the session today. So we've got a series of different things kind of planned throughout the day. Our aim is to finish at around 3 o'clock. There will be lunch at around 12, courtesy of PSGB, who sponsored the event. And yeah, hopefully there'll be lots of chance for you as well to kind of network and get to know one another as well, which is partly the aim of the event as well. So I guess I don't know how much I need to introduce about myself. So obviously I'm the organizer of this event. I'm a philosopher of education. I finished my PhD in 2020, but I've been working as a lecturer at UCL for about 10 years, almost 10 years now, in various different positions. And my interests, I guess, are in sort of existential philosophy and how that's connected to education. And more recently, sort of the intersection between literature, philosophy, and education. That's something that I'm working on at the minute. I guess, first of all, maybe just to talk about what it is that prompted these events. So it's actually quite a concrete example of basically, I did a job interview a couple of years ago now, or maybe last year, and it was a job that I didn't get. And some of the feedback I got was that I didn't really have a clear enough sense of my research journey as it might happen over the next 10 years. And I think this is probably a common enough issue that philosophers of education face. How do we sort of translate our work into something that is perceived as valuable? And unfortunately, that is just the kind of context in which we're working at the minute. And I think what hopefully will come out of these conversations today is that you can still do a lot of this interesting, valuable work that you want to do without sort of selling out your research in a sense. But you are able to get sort of grant money in order to do that in philosophy of education, and hopefully we'll draw on different examples of that throughout the day as well. The reason why I wanted to start these events as well is because I'm quite interested in having some kind of community of early career scholars in philosophy of education. I think we have that sort of informally at PSGB, but certainly I don't know what a lot of people are doing. I don't know what their research interests are. I don't know the possible areas that I could collaborate with other people. So yeah, very instrumentally as well for me, and also hopefully for all of you as well. I just kind of hope that these events will lead to some sort of grassroots early career researcher network. And this is the first event in a series of events. So I've organized 2 other events, one of which is taking place next week. Next week we'll be talking about different international opportunities with philosophers of education, which again will be relevant to philosophers of education, but will also be relevant, I think, to people sort of working mainly in theoretical fields. Yeah, we've got a really good range of speakers from lots of different contexts talking about what it's like to work in that context, but also what kinds of opportunities there might be, either for sort of long-term employment or shorter mobilities, for example. So if you haven't signed up to that event and you're interested, that is the link. And then later on this month, I'll do a shorter session on working and publishing with journals. We will have the editor-in-chief of JOPE, David Backhurst, at that event, and also Professor Paul Standish, who has a lot of experience in publishing. And they're both just going to talk a little bit about things like, how do we put together a special issue for a journal? How do you sort of go about contributing with other people? How do you make sort of connections with other people that you might want to collaborate with? What's it like sort of behind the scenes in the JOPE office? So that kind of thing. So again, that will be a sort of shorter event. It's going to happen in the afternoon because David is based in Canada, so it's only fair that we do it in the afternoon. So again, if you're interested in that event, that's the link. And you can also just email me as well. One thing to say is that we do have quite a little bit of money left over. So PSGB very kindly funded this event, and funded all of the events, in fact, through the development committee. So we have a little bit of money left over. What I'd be interested to hear from you at some point throughout the day is maybe what kinds of interests you might have in possible future events. So I was thinking we could do sort of day conferences where we showcase early career research, or maybe a special issue in the journal for Philosophy of Education, for example. So there's lots of different things that we can do. But also just to say that if you have come from outside London, or in fact, if you've come from inside London, but maybe pretty far away, and you want to have some of your transport covered, for example, then we have the budget to do that. So just come and talk to me during the break, or you can send me an email afterwards as well. So that's essentially what sort of sparked these events. And what I thought we'd do before we kind of get started is to just have a little bit of time on your tables to introduce each other, to talk a little bit about your research interests, and also why you came here today. Like, what are you specifically interested in? Have you any experience with research grant applications, or is this completely new to you? If you do have experience, what has your experience been, right? Has it been successful? Has there been any sort of failures along the way, which of course is very common in our field in many respects. So we'll sort of, I'll give you maybe 15 minutes or so to do that. Please feel free to grab coffee, and we're gonna have a ton of food because there's supposed to be 25 people here, so I ordered catering for 25 people, but obviously there's not. So please help yourself to that. And then after that, we'll have a sort of roundtable discussion and a Q&A with each of the speakers. So they'll just sort of talk a little bit about their experience with research grant applications, and there'll be time for you to ask questions and also to discuss that on your tables. Then we're going to have lunch, which again is going to be catered, so please feel free to eat double portions if you want, and of course to take some home as well if you want to. And then in the afternoon, we'll do some workshop sessions where we'll actually look at some successful grant applications, and we'll just have a think about the sort of language that's used in those grant applications, the different sections that you have to include, the budget, for example, which I personally find really difficult in philosophy of education. I mean, what costs are there associated with thinking stuff? I don't know. But there is a budget that you can work with, so we'll look at some examples of that.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope what I have to say is of some use to you. As you already know, I'm a philosopher of education based at Liverpool Hope University, and back in 2019 I got a Centre for Ethics and Education research grant of the value of around $40,000, and it was to work on punishment, the morality of punishment in schools. And the research body is an American one. The Centre for Ethics and Education Research had some sub-awards to hand out on behalf of the Spencer Foundation, which is a larger foundation with much larger grants to give out, but this one had more of a philosophy of education twist, or an ethics of education twist. It was an American funding body, and I thought it would be canny to team up with Americans to apply for, being British myself and based at a British institution. And I got together with an American political philosopher and philosopher of education, Winston C. Thompson. And we had in mind that we could describe ourselves as a philosopher of education and a kind of political theorist of education. I mean, we're very similar in what we do, but you can kind of describe yourselves in different ways where it makes you look more like you have complementary things to bring to the team, which is somewhat true. And we thought about ways in which we could gather a team of people who represented different identity groups and different disciplines, including disability studies, political theory, criminology, sociology, psychology, amongst other disciplines. And we thought what we'd do is we'd gather these people together with the purpose of having them tell the other people in the group what was the kind of cutting edge, most relevant, most persuasive research in their field. So we got to sort of bring each other up to speed. At a first event, which was based in Ohio, kind of a reading group, which took place over a few days. And then we had a kind of follow-up event several months later over in Liverpool, What we did was, in the intervening period, we had people kind of line up into writing groups, kind of pair off or triple up, and work on papers that they were going to present at this follow-up event. And we'd also identify a commentator to read their paper and give critical feedback, and kind of open up the floor to challenging questions from all of the people representing different disciplines. And we invited additional people who could give some further critical feedback. And this all led to a special issue of Theory and Research in Education, which is one of the leading philosophy of education journals. Although since we're at a Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain event and their journal is Journal of Philosophy of Education, I really ought to say that that's a really excellent journal to submit your work to. And I really think that. So we had some good luck with that grant application, but we'd also submitted to Spencer for a field building grant and also for a small grant, basically to do the same thing, and we were just unlucky on both of those occasions. Perhaps that speaks to the challenge that philosophers of education have trying to communicate the sort of work they want to do to a wider audience. Actually, I think it should be easier for us to say that we're going to do some interdisciplinary work that draws together people representing different disciplines, and amongst those is philosophy, and it will have some implications for how we ought to conduct school punishment in future. It ought to be a fairly easy case to make. And indeed, once you've had a little bit of luck with grants, it's good to sort of build on that and roll into the future and see if you can draw on publications you have got to make future applications. And so that's what Winston and I are doing at the moment. We put in an application for a large grant at Spencer, and we got kind of mixed reviews, which is actually good, right? It's better than all bad reviews. You can largely expect lots of rejections. And it gave us a good clue about how to pitch ourselves for the next application. And one of the real challenges we had was trying to explain to people who are more empirically minded that if you want to do normative work, doing interviews about what people think is right isn't going to tell you what is morally right. And doing experiments won't by themselves tell you what is more or less just. And so it's just about being mindful of who's going to be reading the application and how to forestall some of the objections that they might have. So I'm reasonably optimistic about putting into Spencer again in the future. And one of the good things about Spencer is that you do get detailed feedback. You do get, whatever you think of the reviewer reports, you do get the reviewer reports. You can see what kind of hurdles they have to thinking, to accepting that your research is a good idea and pointing you in better directions if your research isn't such a good idea. Whereas other bodies like Nuffield don't give you those kind of detailed reports, and so it's harder to recalibrate. One thing I think I really should say is that in my experience, research applications have been a bit of a crapshoot. It just does feel somewhat random. Perhaps it's the case that if you have a really good proposal, or people that get grants have really got great proposals, but not everyone with a really good proposal gets a grant. There could just be some confusion that prevents that. And indeed, on another application I put into Spencer, I got top marks for literally everything. It was unbelievable that you could get such good scores from both reviewers, and didn't get given the grant. So I take it they've got a surplus of really excellent applications that they score very highly, and it's just a matter of luck whether or not yours gets selected at that point. So it is achievable, it is worth doing. Getting the money helped me and Winston do good work with interesting people that we would not otherwise have been able to do as well. So it is worth trying for. It's worth being a little bit realistic about the role of luck in whether or not it comes off. And it's also worth being mindful that there can be other ways to do research even without the grant money. So Winston and I went on to publish a book on the philosophy of punishment, and we could just do that by putting in a book proposal to a publisher who accepts it and reading drafts over the internet, and in the world with Zoom, you can have seminars where people attend each other's works in progress session and give useful feedback. So it's all work that can happen anyway, the sort of work we do as philosophers of education anyway. But it is worth applying and it is possible.
When I was a postdoc at Leuven, I was hired to write research proposals, and I must say that was a very dreary activity. But I have found a solution to it, which has been quite successful. The basic idea, the basic advice I would like to give you is that writing research proposals shouldn't be a purely instrumental activity, in the sense that you write in order to get a grant, and that's it. And then, as you have heard, you have to be very lucky, and most of the times you don't get it. But I think you should use the opportunity of writing research grants for another purpose, namely for building an academic career and also building an academic community. I mean, so after my postdoc, I have started working together with other people, writing together on research proposals. And I must say that this was actually rather interesting and at times even fun. Because writing together on research proposals also give you the opportunity to think together, to build new research lines. Very often, even if you don't get the grants you want, you end up writing a book, for instance. So one of the most positive experiences I had, which was successful because I got an internal research grant in Leuven, was due to collaborating together with two other colleagues, scholars. One of them is actually Jesse's supervisor, Joke van der Abele, and the other guy is Hans Schildermans, who will be on the online event next week. So together we wrote a successful proposal, but out of that we also were able to write a few articles, which for me have been quite important, because earlier in response to your question, I referred to this Latourian framework. Well, I actually picked this up by working together with these people, and it became for me a new point of reference. So I really learned something from that. So my main message is don't underestimate the value of collaboration, right? I have applied for many other things in teams. For instance, also twice with success, the educational theory, it's called ETSI, it's Educational Theory something Institute in Urbana-Champaign. It's associated to the journal Educational Theory, and every year you can apply for a kind of symposium that they organize in Urbana-Champaign, and they pay for all the expenses, so flights into the United States. And it's a very interesting format because you will end up writing together a special issue. That's why it's called ETSI, Educational Theory Special Issue, I believe. Yeah. So everybody writes a paper, and then you comment on each other's paper, and you end up with a special issue in educational theory. Of course, this presupposes that you write on the same theme, so there must be a common theme. And again, that's why collaboration is so important, and that in your career you try to team up with people who share a common research interest. So I have worked together with Mandy Fulford and Naomi Hodgson. So together we applied successfully for symposium in Urbana-Champaign on technologies of reading and writing. And later on, together with Naomi and another colleague from Poland, Piotr Zamojski, I wrote a manifesto for post-critical pedagogy, and since then this has also been something we have been working on together with many different people from Europe and the United States. So I guess I'm holding here a plea for networking, but not in a vulgar sense. I really think that building a network around a common concern can be very helpful. Another piece of advice is don't assume that there are no opportunities or possibilities. Very often when I speak with people and I tell them about these opportunities like ETSI or like the large grant scheme, they say, wow, I'm not even going to consider starting this because this is not for me. I really don't think you should start from this mindset. If you don't try, you don't get anything, right? So an important thing to do, I guess, and maybe this is a vulgar kind of networking, but is speak to people who are in charge of these things. I have experienced that going to conferences and attending the receptions can be quite a good place. So speaking to editors of journals in order to get special issues in journals. So I have been, well, successful a few times just by speaking to them, because you think, no, this is not going to work. Well, just speak to them. They are just human beings who are interested in good stuff for their journal. So I would say don't be afraid and speak to people. Another thing is, and again, this might sound very vulgar again, but become involved in, for instance, the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain. There are many opportunities. For instance, you can become a reviewer on the large scheme committee. You can review for Job. There are many opportunities, not only within this society, but also, for instance, within INPI, International Networks of Philosophy of Education. And especially also, for instance, you can volunteer to become reviewer with journals like Educational Philosophy and Theory, EPAT, Educational Philosophy and Theory, because people know your name and they know your field of interest, and you get to review stuff so you know what's going on in your own field. So these are all small steps you can take in order to make progress in the discipline of philosophy of education. At the beginning, Alison was talking about difficulty of getting taken seriously as a philosopher of education when you have to compete with more serious people like psychologists and who have research plans. Well, maybe I can show it to you during the the break, because it will be it will not be very informative just to put it on. But if you're interested, I can show you how you can actually, as a philosopher of education, write research plans that really look decent. So, and serious. Yeah? So, but maybe we can have a look at this during the break if you're interested in that.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'm Emma Williams, currently a reader in education at Warwick University. Thank you, recent promotion plug there. So I thought I would start off with some statistics about myself in terms of grant experience and sort of what I've applied for since I started at Warwick in 2015. So I have been successful with 4 competitive research grants, but I have applied for more than more than double that number. So I think about 9 research grants I've applied for since 2015, so in about 8 years. So yeah, roughly kind of doing probably 1 application a year. So yeah, I suppose I'm highlighting this is a 50% success rate, and I think it kind of speaks to what Joris was saying in his presentation, that you kind of got to be in it to get something. You've got to accept that you're not going to get everything, and rejection is kind of basically part of the experience. And how you negotiate that and how you sort of take the rejection forward further is something that I guess we can discuss more together in the afternoon session perhaps. So although I've applied for 4 grants, I'm not including my PhD funding in this, it's only around 25,000 that I've actually brought into Warwick University. So, in terms of an education department where you've got kind of sociologists and people doing massive scale empirical projects, that's actually pretty small fry in terms of the money. But that's not to say that, that's not recognised. And I think part of what I'll talk about with the 2 examples that I'll give you is that, that can be the small pots of money that are also really helpful and allow you to do lots of things in philosophical research. So yeah, I think don't be afraid to kind of apply for small pots. I think it's still very worthwhile. This is just a list of some of the schemes that I've applied to across the years. As you'll see, there's quite a lot of different, a variety of different schemes there. And I'm happy to talk more about any of those if you're specifically interested in applying to any of them. But what I'm going to talk to you about in this sort of 10 minutes is my experience on 2 of those schemes. So one which was unsuccessful, and then one where I was successful. So the unsuccessful one is the AHRC, it was actually the HRC Leadership Fellowship that I applied for. So that's the Arts and Humanities Research Council, a fellowship for an individual project. So it wasn't a project part of a team. It's just a sort of project that is funding an individual researcher. I think Jane is going to talk maybe about that as well. Yeah. And then the successful one was, I've got it on there. Oh yeah, the British Academy Leave Hume Small Research Grant. So I'll talk about the AHRC one first, because this was the first application, first sort of funding scheme that I wrote a research application for. Actually, this scheme is now closed. They run a sort of early career version and a one for senior academics. They've now closed that scheme, and I think they're reconfiguring that scheme into another type of funding. So it might be one to look at, because there's definitely part of this which is targeted at early career researchers and developing your kind of leadership capacities within the field. So it is a really attractive scheme, I think, for philosophers, because we do tend to, and maybe wrongly, work quite individually on our research. And so getting something like a fellowship sort of fits naturally with the philosophical style of work. So when I applied for this scheme, the budget was for projects were between £50,000 and £250,000. So it's quite a big pot of money. And the crucial thing about the funds for this scheme is that it can be used for buyout. So if you're on a teaching contract or a research and teaching contract, then you can use the funds from this scheme to buy you out of your teaching, and it gives you then the sort of really focused time for researching. And they're usually for about 2 years, these sorts of fellowships. So if you think about it, you're kind of being brought out of teaching for 2 years. It's a long time for you to just have focused time for research, which is great. So I applied for this scheme in 2018, I think it was, when I'd been at Warwick for about 3 years at that point, and I applied for a project on humanities education, so kind of tying into the debate about crisis in the humanities, and I was kind of extending some work that I'd done for my PhD to sort of conceive of a project that was going to be about kind of rethinking the arguments for the value of the humanities in education. I thought that was a great idea. As I said, these are kind of pretty sizable grants, and so the application pack itself reflected that. So I've just kind of put a list of everything that was required in that application, and this was quite a substantial piece of work that I was dedicating my time to putting together just to apply for this grant. A kind of 7-page case for support in itself that was about 5,000 words long. So I think I spent about 8 months or 9 months in total to get to a stage where I then applied for the project. So it was a big time investment, and I would say that's probably something that I didn't necessarily think through when I went into it, thinking, yeah, I'm going to apply for this scheme. In terms of the budget, I know Alison mentioned earlier the sort of thing about philosophy and where you spend the money, and I think this scheme, because you could apply for the buyout of your time, it wasn't as, it was very easy to kind of make up, the budget. But I also applied for things like organising conferences, policymakers, a workshop with policymakers, and I was also, as part of this project, doing some kind of co-created research with school teachers, and the workshops for them were actually going to cost quite a lot to put together because I was paying for everyone's travel and hosting them, that sort of thing. So it was actually very easy to get the budget up to that amount. At Warwick, we have a kind of research and impact services team, which I think most institutions probably have, and I would say that engaging with them from an early stage really helped me to get my head around what's going to be conceivable within the budget, because as I said, I was doing this, I'd never really done a funding application for a major project before, so I really had no idea what I could get for 250,000, but they really helped me to sort of see what's realistic within that budget. So yeah, I'm not going to talk through the application in detail, I don't want to relive it, but I'll just sort of pick out a couple of key things that I'd reflect on from that experience. It might be helpful for you to think about if you were considering applying for a scheme like this. The first one I've sort of touched on already. I do wonder whether it was worth my time at that point in my career to take kind of almost a year out of my the time I have allocated to research as part of my job to complete a funding application. And I really think that is something to keep in mind, because as I say, it was about 8 or 9 months that I really spent, and maybe I could have written a paper in that time or 2 papers in that time, to have 2 more publications in my CV. So I think if you're at a point where you've got different competing things on your plate, then maybe going in for a really big funding grant is just something that you want to think about. Is it worth your time investing in this at this stage? I suppose the second thing, looking back, was would it have actually been the best thing for me even if I'd been successful with that project at that stage in my career? Because we're talking about a fellowship that kind of takes you away from your community in your institution. You're not teaching. Okay, that's great, you have this kind of concentrated time for your research, But given it's quite an individual project, very focused on, you know, developing yourself, you're not really going to get the same chance for networking and for building those links and collaboration that you kind of naturally get when you're, you know, in your institution every day on a daily basis. Obviously you can go to seminars and things, but I suppose personally, I think probably it wouldn't have been the best thing for me anyway to almost be doing another PhD, you know, project straight after my first PhD. It might also have maybe narrowed my portfolio of things that I'm interested in researching a little bit, because it's quite an investment to think, well, I'm going to look at this topic for the next 2 or 3 years of my, you know, they're funding you to be 100% on this this project. So that means that I've really got to look at, you know, these arguments about the humanities for the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe my research interests are going to change. Maybe there's going to be other opportunities that I can't get involved with because I'm 100% of time on this project. So there are, I think, like, although it's very prestigious to get these awards and they're great, I also think there are like cons to them which is worth thinking about. And then the third point is about the funder, and I suppose whether I really had thought through when I applied whether the AHRC were the best funding body for me. I think we've already kind of touched on this, but I think philosophy of education is really in a tricky spot in relation to some of these major research councils, because when you apply, you have to sort of put your the classification for your project. You have to say like which subject area in particular, you know, best describes the research for in your proposal. Because it's AHRC, you'd be looking at putting philosophy down as the major field, because HRC doesn't cover education as the principal field. But then when you click on philosophy and you look at all the subcategories that you can choose, you've got aesthetics, you've got ethics, you've got philosophy of mind, there's no philosophy of education. So it's like, oh, okay, what best describes philosophy of education from that list? And it really isn't very clear. I think there's something like applied philosophy, but given I was writing from a more kind of continental perspective, I didn't feel that was going to be, they were going to be the best people to review my application. So I think I ended up putting something like history of ideas or something. So it was almost like very remote from what I was actually talking about. You can choose a subfield of education, but even then, you look at education, there's sociology of education, there's like curriculum studies, policy studies, there's no philosophy of education there either. So again, I was like, oh, who in education is going to get sent this proposal? And the reason it matters is because those classifications, I think they help the council to identify who's going to be the best reviewer for your project. So if you put down philosophy of mind, you know, they will kind of look at who they've got on their books and specialise in philosophy of mind, and your application can be funneled towards the right people. But it's very difficult, I think, for philosophers of education currently with these research councils, because you don't have that option. And I really think we need to try and change that going forward. So that would be an agenda for the future. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the review process, just briefly. Following on from that, the reviews took about 9 months to come through, I think, for this scheme. So again, it's a really long time you're waiting around to know, have I got this funding? Am I going to be off for 2 years doing this project or not? And you know, by the time you get the reviews back, you've kind of almost moved on and you're thinking, and you're like, what did I write? What was I going to do for the application? Oh, right, okay. So I think that's another factor if you're an early career researcher. You know, at those early stages, you want to be involved in lots of things. Hanging around for 9 months to know whether you're going to be doing this is quite an ask, I think. So on this scheme that I applied for, you get a chance to see the reviews and chance to respond to the reviews. So you kind of get sent the 3 reviews from the panel, and then you write a kind of, you know, rebuttal of the reviews, which was also like another thing to have to do, which was a bit depressing. Mine came through when I was on holiday, which was really annoying, and I knew it was going to happen. So that's another thing, think about the timing of when you apply for things. So I thought I'd just share an example. So this is an example of probably the worst review that I got. And I think looking at this had been sent to, I think I put down curriculum studies as one of the subcategories. So I suspect this was sent to someone who researches curriculum, maybe from more like empirical perspectives. So this is their kind of conclusion. They wrote some worse things than this elsewhere on the form. But as you can see, yeah, they kind of say, great aspiration to proposal, but if it seeks to achieve more convincing results, it may need to move from being a philosophical exploration. So that was the kind of tenor of this review. They were basically saying, philosophy isn't going to answer these questions. So, you know, although this has got a good heart to it, you haven't really got a clue about how you can answer the questions, because you don't know what it's like to work with teachers. You don't know what it's like to, you know, be in a school, which is really annoying given I had like 8 years experience working in a school. But, you know, obviously, as soon as they saw philosophy, they kind of had a sense of, no, you don't know what's going on in the real world. And that was quite frustrating. The rankings here, this is like the score that they give overall to the application. So a 3 was like, yeah, okay, I suppose, you know, maybe. I got a 4 and a 5 on the other ones, which I think were, looking at them, they seem to be more from philosophers. But just getting something like this, it's very depressing, because you've spent, you know, 8 months of your life working on this project. You've tried to explain everything really well in the space that you've got. And then, you know, they're just open to being read very variably. I think that's just the experience I got. I didn't expect that someone would criticise it for that reason, but obviously I hadn't said enough about how I understood the kind of educational context and why I thought this would be relevant for teachers. So there's just so many things that you need to keep in your head when you're doing these proposals that obviously you can't do everything. So that was a bit of a depressing outcome, and yeah, it wasn't funded in the end, although I think it was looked at a bit more favourably in the end panel discussion that they had. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that the reviewers aren't always everything, and there is usually kind of a final panel that things go to. So there might be someone that will, like, you know, see through the negatives, but anyway, in this case there wasn't.
Can I just ask? So
yeah.
When you submit the application, you get the reviews, then you can like respond to the reviews. And
Yeah.
then is that like, is there any point to that? I mean, like,
Yeah.
Do we actually
So
take response here?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So I don't think the response goes to the reviewers, which is frustrating, because you kind of want to be like, yeah, you didn't understand it. I think your response goes then to the final panel discussion that they have.
Okay.
So if you've got, I suppose if you get over a certain threshold, maybe they take it to the panel and then they look at your response to the reviews there. Yeah, but I don't know if that's just a thing on some of these schemes, because it's not often that you'll get the chance to respond to the reviews that you get. So yeah, you might. That's not to say you have to do that.
Yeah.
Do you remember how you responded to this particular?
Yeah. So my colleague advised me to like write a response and then just rip it up and throw it away, because you're not going to send that one, which I did. And then yeah, I just kind of said, you know, while this is a really, you know, important point to make, that would be a different project, and you know, my point is that I'm doing this because there's already a lot of empirical work into that area, and I'm adding something different by looking at it from a philosophical perspective. Yeah, I thought it was good.
Philosophers were probably quite good at responding to criticism because we get so much of it
Yeah.
all the time. So.
But it's hard not to sound defensive, because you know, you can kind of, as a philosopher as well, like pick it bit by bit, and that's why I sort of initially did like it was a kind of counter argument in a paper or something. I was like, no, they're not going to take kindly to that. So you have to kind of look like you know, you do really appreciate the feedback. And to be fair, you know, yeah, maybe some of what they're saying is right. So on a more positive note, I think that experience with the AHRC in 2018 did really help me when I came to apply for a BA Leverhulme Small grant, which I did in 2019, so it was only actually a year later. This is a much smaller grant, It's for £10,000, and the key thing is you can't have any sort of buyout for your teaching. The £10,000 is just to support the expenses associated with you doing the research. So yeah, again, that's a bit tricky for philosophers because we think, well, if you're doing empirical research, it's obvious what you might need those funds for. But on the application I did, for example, I applied for, you can use the funds to recruit a research assistant on the project. You can also, I applied for creating some educational podcasts. So I applied for the money for like hiring a sound booth and hiring technical assistants and equipment, that kind of thing. Also putting together like events, seminars, conferences, that sort of stuff. So actually I ended up yeah, so you're going to see the example of the... No, that's okay. So this project... it's been redacted. But it was... So this project was actually about mental health and philosophy in schools. But... Oh, yeah. But it did pick up on some elements of what I'd done for the humanities. And in a way, I think I probably just slightly reformulated the arguments that I was thinking of in that context and put them into a different context, thinking about mental health and humanities approaches to mental health. So I suppose it tied it a bit more readily to something that was, current at the time. And this application, it was a lot quicker. I think I started it in May and I applied for it in June. And it's not as lengthy as the AHRC one. And yeah, you'll see the example this afternoon. So you still need to kind of work out quite a lot of what you're going to do over the time, like do a work plan, have a budget, have an outputs dissemination plan. So there's still quite a lot of elements to the application, but you can be just a bit briefer, I think, with this scheme. I mean, one, I suppose, downside of the shorter thing is you've got to squeeze everything into quite a short space that you can fill. So in a way, it's easier to do something longer sometimes in philosophy, isn't it? I think the BA lever here, I don't think it's explicitly about piloting an early stage research, but early career researchers, but I think it is the scheme naturally lends itself to that. And although it has to be a defined project in its own right with this £10,000, you can conceive it, as I did, as a pilot to something bigger. And that's, in a way, I suppose, you could get a BA grant and then maybe think about developing it into a fellowship grant. You might be able to build up incrementally, and maybe that's what I should have done to start off with. So just some kind of reflection. I think I've already sort of said this, but it was much quicker to complete the application, and I think there's pros and cons to that because, you don't have the space to say everything that you want to, so it's a bit of a risk. Thinking about what you need the money for, as I said, I guess you've got to be a bit creative there. And I think if you just say things like it's for conferences or seminars, that's not quite what the scheme's designed for, because the money's there to sort of support the research. So, but if you were doing a kind of work in progress seminar or something where you're going to be creating research together, then I think that's more the sort of way to phrase it. The collaboration with the PSGB with British Academy is really handy. So whereas the AHRC and ESRC don't seem to really realise that philosophy of education exists, the BA do have these partnerships with various educational societies, and they have got one with PSGB. So they're aware of, the fact that there is this philosophical approach you can take to thinking about education. And if you get through the BA review process, so your application is always going to be reviewed by the fellows at the BA, but then if they decide they want to fund your project, then they approach PSGB and they say, would you like to kind of partner up and go halves with us funding this project? So that's the way that you can then have a BA Leverhulme grant, but also one that's got the kind of PSGB stamp of approval, if you want to think it that way, too. So but I think the fact that there is that partnership makes this funder quite open to philosophy of education research, potentially. Okay, so just a very brief conclusion, because I've been talking for ages now. So I think some things that maybe I've learned from the two examples that I've discussed, like the AHRC, then the BA, is I do think you get better at bid writing as you do more of it. I definitely feel that anyway for myself. The more I've kind of applied for, the more I've been able to hone the sort of style that you need to write in. I think finding the right fit with a funder is important. And I didn't really realise the thing about the HRC until the day I was submitting the application. And that kind of instantly made me think, oh God, maybe I should have really looked into these things before I actually started on this 8-month, 10,000 word application. And then I guess considering the time in your career trajectory is useful. Obviously the big grants have got benefits, but like I say, they will take you away from some other stuff because you'll be dedicated to a big project for quite a lot of your early career. And the smaller pots of money can be very useful to grow your kind of funding portfolio. So, you can have a number of different funders, even if they're little small pots. But that shows that you've got, you've kind of gone out there, saw where you could get some money, been involved in different kinds of projects, and potentially they also then make you better placed for doing a major research project, maybe like later on in your career, as like a senior fellowship, something like that. So that would be my own personal reflections.
Okay, so there's a few things I just want that have come up that I'll cover first. The first thing is there's questions about like budgets and how to work out budgets. And I just want to say that there are people in your in institutions who do that for you, and they're great. Like you send them what you want to do and they send you the costings and it looks professional, and you just input that into the application and that goes out. In terms of spending, it's true that as philosophers of education we can do most things for free. And a lot of things don't cost very much, like getting people together for a workshop will cost travel expenses, accommodation expenses, food expenses, that's kind of it. But the things that cost a lot of money are if you want to hire someone. That's when it goes astronomical really quickly. So that can be good and bad. So I thought it's interesting to say why you might apply for funding. Because you get funding and then you have to do the work for it, right? So it's not necessarily something that you might want to do. But the things that have motivated me in the first instance when I was looking at fellowships were for job applications, because it's really a big seal of approval and it helps you to get another job, and it did for me. In fact, when I was hired, they were looking for two new positions in the department. They hired me and they hired someone else who'd done exactly the same funding scheme as me, just in a completely different area. So in both cases, that worked in our favour. But then now I have a job, there's internal pressure from my university to bring in a certain amount of funding so that I can be promoted, so that I can pass my probation, and also if I wanted to move somewhere else, it would allow me that sort of flexibility to say, look, I'm competitive. In those cases, if it's to get a certain amount of funding to be promoted, then actually it's in my interest to ask for lots of money to hire someone in, rather than to do the work on a small amount of money. So there's funny considerations that you wouldn't really think of. I guess the other reason you'd want to look for funding is out of interest, and because it's something that you're really passionate about, you want to get people together for, and maybe you don't want to just work on your own on something. So that's more kind of like, it's just for fun. Yeah, and then, I mean, saying all of those things, there is, obviously if you can do lots of research without funding. You can do lots of things in the time when you're not teaching. So it's not necessarily something that has to happen. And the other thing that I'd say is that not all funding sources are very competitive. So sometimes it's just a matter of knowing the right people and knowing that, like, actually we're really looking for people to apply and we're anxious no one's going to. We have this pot of money that we want to give out. For me, it was one thing that was helpful was I had an ESRC funded PhD, and my supervisor was at the time the person who was in charge of the ESRC funds. So that really helps. And then I did an overseas institutional visit, which actually, you have to apply for funding to do, but I knew through him that not many people were applying for that, and that they were really keen for people to apply for that, and there was just money lying around that was ready to be taken. So if you can find the right people to speak to, you can find out about places where there's money that's not really being used, and then that's a nice, easy thing to go for. Whereas I think in the back of my head, I just would have assumed, oh, it's super competitive. I wouldn't stand a chance. It's not necessarily always true. Okay, so those were the general things that I was just listening to and came up. And then I guess I'll tell you my story from 2021 onwards. So I think if I think about who I am as in academia, I've been very determined to cling on to it. I really like it as a job. And so I always tried to do as much as I could. And so by the point of finishing my PhD, and I was looking at my CV at the time, when I was applying for things, I had 6 papers either published or forthcoming. That was like how I wanted to get to a, you know, people tell you need publications to get jobs, so I really took that on board quite maybe too seriously. So that's where I was at. And it does, I mean, I think it does help because if someone's funding you, they want to see they're going to get something out of it. So if you can show that you can publish, then they'll at least be like, well, okay, this person can publish. They'll probably get some publications out of this funding. I think that helps. So in April 2021, it was in the lull of the pandemic, things were still online. I applied for a Society for Applied Philosophy short-term postdoctoral fellowship. So that was from the Society for Applied Philosophy, which is more philosophy proper than education. And that was a scheme that they set up to support postdoctoral researchers because there was a lull in jobs after the pandemic. And that scheme's still running. And the scheme is it's part-time, it doesn't give you a huge amount of money, is designed to give you some living costs and to give you a little leg up for your job applications. So I think that was £4,500. And I spent that on survival costs, but also I visited the University of Helsinki. They have an institute called TINT, which is on the philosophy of social sciences. And so I went there for just a month, I think. And also as part of the funding, I worked on 2 papers. So that was a 6-month little thing. And that made me, I think, at a point in your career where you are at the end of your PhD and you kind of fall into a void of there being nothing, that was really valuable to me. So I'd recommend looking them up. And I think this is one of those things where someone had sent me an email around about it saying, you could apply for this. So there are little schemes out there like that can really be very valuable at an early stage. During that time, sort of before and after that, I was also applying for bigger fellowships. So I applied for 3. I applied through Leverhulme, through British Academy, and through the ESRC. And I got one, the shorter one. So the Leverhulme and British Academy are 3-year ones, and the ESRC one is 1 year. So for Leverhulme, I approached Nottingham University, their philosophy department, because I know some philosophers there who work in similar areas to me, and I knew that they would be sympathetic. And I got through their internal process, which felt like it had like 5 rounds or something. It was really hard, but it kept getting accepted through to the next stage. And then I was allowed to put in an application to Leverhulme. And the topic was on how we think about knowledge in education. And I really enjoyed writing the application, putting together what I would do in the future, how it would work. It wasn't particularly long. It wasn't like the one that Emma describes. The Leverhulme and British Academy are both relatively short applications. And so I got to the stage where I could submit that, and that was not successful. That was quite a short turnaround. I didn't have to wait very long. It wasn't successful, so moved on. And then about the same time, I applied for the ESRC postdoctoral fellowship at Birmingham, which was the university that I did my PhD at. That didn't want you. It didn't want me to do it didn't want me to take on a new project. It wanted me to extend my PhD. So I could take what I did in the years of my PhD and say I'll use another year to extend it, to show impact. And so I think I said and I did, that I would turn my PhD into a book. That's what I spent the majority of the time on, but also make some resources, set up some meetings to create some awareness of my PhD. That's one of the ones we'll look at later. So it's relatively straightforward things, just pulling out that same idea, and then they give you a bit of extra time to work on things that might lead you in a new direction. And they'd supported my PhD as well. So I think I already knew that there was at least someone sympathetic on that panel to this kind of work. That one has a very short time frame when you're eligible to apply. You need to make sure that you're not too far away from your viva, but you actually have to have had your viva, or there's complicated rules around it. So it's worth looking into carefully to make sure that you don't miss that little time frame when you can apply. And then I think before I knew that I had that, I'd started applying through the British Academy, and I applied via UCL. So I approached someone here in the philosophy and political theory, I think. Again, that got through institutional barriers, but it was unsuccessful at the final application. Both the unsuccessful ones I got no feedback from. You get nothing at all, you just get a rejection. Sorry, there were thousands of applicants and yours wasn't one of the 30 that we fund, something like that. I would say, I think the thing that has been nice about that application process was those were both the same projects I applied for, British Academy and Leverhulme. I just thought, give it another shot a second time, why not? Based on the no feedback I got, I'll just try a different institution, get some different feedback from a different institution. It's not that I've really valued having that project and having thought it through and still having it as part of what I'm interested in. And I am working on papers that are kind of moving in that direction, because now I have a job as a lecturer at university. I have research time. I need something to direct me to, in what I'm doing. And so it's not that it was wasted work. I spent that time after my PhD thinking about what I'd like to do in the future. And just because I didn't get funding doesn't mean that I can't do it. So I would say that it's not a waste of time. It's a way of sitting down and thinking about what you want to do. Also, I found a lot of job applications asked for my research plans, and then I had kind of already made one. So that was useful. And maybe you made a research plan and you could put it into a funding application. You know, they're designed for the same kind of thing. Okay, so I got the ESRC postdoctoral fellowship. That was great. That was my success. And that's what we'll look at later as an example. And I was very, very fortunate to get that, and it served me well. It allowed me to get an academic job. Since then, I've had a little bit more success with small pots of money. So the ESRC one looks like a big amount of money because it funds my employment. So like I said, whenever you hire someone, it turns into astronomical amounts of money. But the other ones I've maybe been able to do more with, but have been much smaller bits of money. So during that year with ESRC, I applied for a small grant with the Society for Educational Studies. There's a few people in the room who've been involved in that small grant. So that gave me £7,000 to get people together to do a workshop on conceptual engineering in education, and then from that to hire someone to help to edit a book and to bring together an edited book, which we're working on at the moment. So I think that was one that wasn't very competitive. I think that was a source of funding where there actually wasn't very much competition, but they didn't advertise it very widely. And I know that there's a philosopher of education who's high up in that society who was probably on the panel looking at the applications. So I recommend applying for the Society for Educational Studies small grants. They were great. And it was a bit awkward at the time because I was I was on a one-year contract as my ESRC grant. I knew it was going to end, and I was applying for money for the next year, so I was kind of outside of an institution. Birmingham was quite happy to support it. The reason I hired it, anyway, Birmingham was quite happy to support it, but then I got a different job and I had to move it, and that was also possible. It wasn't something that was impossible. It was awkward and annoying to move it, but it wasn't unheard of. People knew about it. I was able to do it. I also feel that Society of Educational Studies would have worked with me to find a solution if I'd ended up unemployed. So depending on, that's a small funding body, it's a friendly group of people. There is actually a human on the other end who will give you feedback and talk to you. There are ways of being flexible about some sources of funding anyway. And then since starting my job at Swansea, I've received some internal funding, which I wouldn't have been eligible to apply for if I was a PhD student, but I would have been if I was a postdoctoral fellow. So even if I was working, not even fellow, but doing a postdoc for someone else, I would have been eligible to apply for So you didn't have to have a permanent job there. And that was actually quite generous. So the point of that funding is to apply for more funding, is to apply for a large research grant. And they gave me £13,000 to, most of it has been on a research assistant, and then to run 2 workshops. And that's looking at the new curriculum for Wales. And that, wasn't hugely competitive, I don't think. I think they gave us 6 people funding and maybe they had like 60 applicants or something. So it was a bit of luck, but it was internal and the turnaround was very short. When you see something like that, you think, okay, they probably don't have that many people leaping at this opportunity because people don't have time to formulate an idea. Whereas I've had this idea for a few months, I'll give it a go. And so I've been lucky with that as well. And from there, I suppose my plan would be will be to apply for quite a large grant. But again, it's going to be a matter of, okay, how much time do I spend on that, like Emma was saying, and what am I going to get out of it? So if I am spending time on it, if I don't get the funding, will I be able to continue that work anyway, and will it have been worth putting the time in to doing that kind of planning? So yeah, that's been my relatively wild ride on exploring funding since finishing my PhD.